The Sonyverse concluded roughly 1 year ago with the release of Kraven the Hunter, and this quote-unquote universe is known for having some of the worst comic book movies of all time. The Sonyverse consisted of 6 movies: the Venom trilogy, Morbius, Madam Web, and Kraven the Hunter. Now that this universe seems to have come to a close, I want to take a look back at these 6 films all these years later. How bad are these movies? Do fans over-exaggerate, or are they truly the worst of the worst when it comes to comic book movies? We are going to go through these movies in release order. So let's travel back in time 7 years to 2018 and look at Venom 1. Venom was honestly a lot of fun. The universe may not be great, but the Sonyverse got off to a good start. Would I consider it a great comic book movie? No, not at all, not even close. But it was a lot of fun. And honestly, that is maybe the nicest thing I could say about any of these movies in the Sonyverse. It is quite refreshing to laugh with one of these movies rather than laughing at it. As you'll see with the rest of the video, I spend a lot of time laughing at these movies. So what about Venom really works and what doesn't work? First and foremost, the relationship between Eddie and Venom is great. Tom Hardy may not have been given a great script, but he certainly gives a great performance. I'm not really familiar with the comic book lore. I know a lot of people supposedly wish Venom was more of a horror movie rather than a goofy movie, but I love the goofy take on this character, at least for now. After the prologue, Eddie has pretty much lost everything: his fiance, his job, and most importantly, his respect. So flash forward, and he's now a total loser. Once Venom merges with Eddie, the back and forth the two have where Venom repeatedly calls Eddie a loser was hilarious. And then Eddie's reaction to all these new powers he has was funny as well. Venom is a perfect example of how well acting and characters can carry a bad movie. The skittish and twitchy performance Hardy gives his relationship with Venom this extra layer that I really liked. Supposedly Venom from his home planet was such a loser too, so it makes sense these two would bond. I'll also give this movie credit for this. I liked the supporting characters for the most part. Anne and Dan were welcome additions to the cast. I liked that this movie wasn't too cliche. Sure, Eddie is trying to get back with his ex, but the movie doesn't end with that happening. Also, Anne isn't some really annoying ex. It was actually quite endearing that she still cared for Eddie and wanted to make sure he was okay. The same could be said for Dan. He wasn't some douchebag who was clearly a worse person than Eddie. He seemed like a good person too, and it was sweet that he wanted to help Eddie. Now the villain, Carlton Drake, is mostly a weak villain. He's the standard billionaire who does really shady things so he could either make more money or achieve some shitty goal. In the case of Drake, he thinks joining the symbiote with humans will somehow create the perfect organism, but of course he starts sacrificing innocent lives to achieve it. It's basic, but I will say Riz Ahmed gave an interesting performance, but besides that, the character was pretty flat, especially when it came to Riot at the end of the movie. So the strongest part of this movie is clearly the characters. Now where this movie absolutely struggles is with the writing. You see, back in 2018 when this movie came out, there was a big debate between critics and audiences. Shocker, that never happens. Critics hated this movie and fans loved it. I can honestly see where both are coming from. Fans loved Eddie and Venom, so they loved this movie. Critics saw everything else and were like, yep, this movie isn't good. There really isn't much of a story here with Venom. The movie begins and Brock makes some serious mistakes. This could have been the beginning of an arc for Eddie. He suffered the consequences of his actions, which is something I love. Flash forward and he's down on his luck. Boom, he meets Venom, and then that's kind of it. It's not like Eddie has some deep arc or anything. Actually, after he meets Venom, he mostly becomes a passive character. He's just getting chased around everywhere, and then Venom tells him they need to stop Riot or he'll destroy the world, and then they do that. So again, no rich arc or themes here. There's also a lot of exposition in the movie. Instead of showing us that Eddie is a good reporter, we just get a brief montage of reports he's done. It's not the same. There's also a lot of little silly things that make me scratch my head, like how Riot is destroyed with fire, but that's never really set up as a weakness. I think there was one throwaway line, but we literally see Eddie drive through fire and Venom seems fine. I think I'm being too nitpicky here. Clearly the people who love this movie don't think it's actually some cinematic masterpiece, they love it for Eddie and Venom. And frankly, that's the same reason why I enjoyed this movie. Venom scored a 31% on Rotten Tomatoes along with an 80% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.6 out of 10. Venom had a monster gross of $856 million, so this movie was clearly a financial success, which would make it understandable that they turned Venom into a trilogy. Let's continue on and take a look at Venom 2. Now, one of the coolest things about franchises like Marvel or anything else is that there is a lot of awesome memorabilia. Thankfully, you can use Whatnot, the sponsor for today's video, to buy some really cool stuff. Whatnot is a live stream shopping app where you can buy, sell, or auction literally anything, especially nerdy stuff like Funko Pops, Pokemon cards, and comic books. Since this is a Marvel video, I want to take a look and see what comic books I can get from Whatnot. I found this Marvel Zombies comic book off an auction that looks really awesome. There were also some other cool comic books like this Secret Wars comic that interested me too. Now, there are plenty of other franchises you can get stuff from as well, not just Marvel. Like I got this Star Wars comic book that has an awesome cover from a different auction. By the way, if you don't want to bid on stuff at an auction, you can go to the Buy It Now page and buy stuff on the spot. Whatnot is so awesome because you can find some really good deals here that you can't find anywhere else. Also, the sellers on Whatnot are really cool and have an awesome community. If you use my link in the description or scan the QR code, you'll get $15 off your first purchase, redeemable anywhere on the app. Again, that's $15 off when you sign up today. Thank you so much to Whatnot for sponsoring this video. Venom There Be Carnage is a really stupid movie. Like, this movie is dumb, but you know what? I'll give this movie credit. At least it knows it's stupid. Surprisingly, this movie was directed by Andy Serkis. You would think that someone of Andy's pedigree would make a much better movie, but I think he made the movie exactly how he wanted it to be made, because Venom 2 is a masterclass in superhero slop. This movie doesn't make any attempt to make sense or to develop the characters in any meaningful way. It just has two main priorities: make Eddie and Venom funny and to have some solid action. And the movie has that. Eddie and Venom are still as funny as they were in the first movie. In this movie, they're a bit more like an old married couple. They're bickering constantly the whole movie. They even somehow managed to have a fight, and seeing Eddie essentially fight himself was quite entertaining. With the first movie, there was at least some attempt to make Eddie a competent character, like someone who maybe at one point in their life was good at their job, but here that is all out the window. Eddie is a complete goof who bickers with Venom and does the bare minimum with his job. If anything, Venom is a better reporter than Eddie is. If I had to compare this dynamic between the two films, I think the first movie is still better. There is a lot of excellent humor that stems from Eddie first finding out about Venom and what he can do. Since the two are obviously familiar with each other here in the second movie, you don't get that same humor, but their dynamic still works. Now, remember how I said this movie doesn't make any attempt to make sense? Yeah, I stand by that. This movie has so many conveniences that it becomes laughable. So Cletus Cassidy is a serial killer, and for some reason he wants to talk to Eddie. Why? I couldn't tell you. Eventually, Eddie/Venom discover some clues, which leads to them finding out where Cletus hid all of his victims. Then Cletus gets mad about this and proceeds to bite Eddie. Now, I'm no expert on the Venom lore, but apparently biting Eddie means you can ingest some of the symbiote and grow one yourself. And this eventually becomes Carnage. Once Carnage and Cletus escape, Carnage uses his powers to hack into a computer, access the military network, and find Cletus's long-lost girlfriend. I was in awe while this whole sequence played out. So apparently the symbiotes can do anything now. They can hack into computers, and they also have photographic memories based on what Venom did earlier. You know what? Fine. Just take me along for the ride at this point. So Cletus wants Eddie, the Shrieking Lady wants the cop, and Carnage wants Venom. Why does Carnage want Venom? I couldn't tell you. Is there any remote depth behind Cletus or the Shrieking Lady? No. They just kill people and have fun doing it. I thought it was so funny that all movie these two are killing people left and right, but towards the climax of the movie, Carnage is about to kill Anne, and the Shrieking Lady is like, "No, stop, you're going too far." What? The two of you just killed a priest like 5 minutes ago. That wasn't too far? Eventually, Carnage and Cletus quote-unquote break up because Carnage is fed up with the Shrieking Lady, and that's it. That's how Venom and Eddie were able to win the final fight. Here's the big question. Do I actually like Venom 2? No. I can respect it for knowing what it is, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. The first one, while mostly being a goofy comic book movie, at least had an ounce of seriousness behind it. Eddie wasn't a complete cartoon character, and there was an attempt to give him some depth. This movie is just 100% comic book slop, I said it earlier, which is fine. I just can't get behind that. Venom Let There Be Carnage scored a 58% on Rotten Tomatoes along with an 83% audience score. How this movie scored nearly 30 percentage points better, I couldn't tell you. On IMDb, this movie scored a 5.9 out of 10. Venom 2 would end up grossing $506 million at the box office, so nearly a $350 million drop from the first movie. I think when a movie knows how stupid it is, it gives it protection from reaching the truly terrible tier of superhero movies. When a movie is trying to be good and it ends up being this bad, that is when it starts to be mocked for how bad it is. We're going to stick to the release order of the Sonyverse, which means we get a break from the Venom movies and we get to talk about some of the spin-offs. Up first, Morbius. Morbius is so bad, but what makes this film leagues more interesting than the rest of the films on this list is the fact that it was of course memed to oblivion. There are plenty of bad movies, and I would argue there are some superhero movies that are even worse than Morbius. But how the hell did this movie turn into the face of meme culture for a few months? Well, let's start from the beginning. You see, unlike Venom, who is a relatively well-known Spider-Man villain, no one knows who the hell Michael Morbius is. But because of the immense success of the first Venom movie and the rising popularity of the MCU, Sony assumed that any Marvel movie would be a box office hit. Morbius began filming in 2019, right during the height of Avengers Endgame, and it was originally scheduled to release in July of 2020. But of course, the pandemic hit and delayed this film for just under 2 years. A teaser trailer was even released in January of 2020, and people knew instantly that this movie seemed funny, not in a good way. I will attest that the facial CGI of the vampires in this movie looks so off-putting I don't know how to describe it. But anyway, it wouldn't be for another 2 years, until funny enough April Fools of 2022, that this movie would be released. So, what makes Morbius so bad? Well, I think the biggest reason why is just because of how lazy the movie is. I think when a movie is just bad, most people forget about it. But sometimes when a movie is just lazy, it starts to become funny at points, and that's part of what makes it so memorable. The movie begins and we're repeatedly told through exposition that Dr. Michael Morbius is a doctor. His origin story is that he is someone with a rare blood disease. When he was at the hospital, there he met his soon-to-be best friend Milo. Now Morbius is no ordinary doctor. This guy is something special, a super genius. Do the writers think of a clever way to convey that? No. In the middle of a conversation during the flashback, Milo just leans over and dies, and Morbius proceeds to save him with a spring in a pen. There's no setup here. The kid just leans over and dies for a few seconds. So after this one incident, the lead doctor at the hospital thinks they should send Morbius to New York, where he can get a special education to become a doctor. That's all it took. See how lazy this all is? There was no effort to do anything clever. It's as if the writers just need to convey information in the quickest way possible, and how said information is conveyed doesn't matter at all. So as an adult, Morbius wants to fix his blood problem. He comes up with an idea to mix human blood with bat blood. He does one test where he injects bat blood into a rat, and just because the rat doesn't die, he's fully ready to test it on himself. He calls up some random mercenaries he happens to know, asks his other doctor friend who will gladly join him to help, and they do this experiment. Again, there's no build up here for anything. Now, of course, Morbius becomes a vampire and starts killing everyone, but he can't kill Martine, the other doctor, so the writers just have the mercenaries throw her into a desk and knock her out for no good reason. Eventually, Morbius escapes, goes back to his lab, and tests his new powers. It needs to be emphasized how terrible of a character Michael Morbius is. Morbius wanted to do this experiment so he could cure himself of his disease. That's it. That's the extent of his character. Does he want to cure himself for any specific reason? Like a reason that would make this story more interesting and not, I don't want to have a disease anymore? No. There's one throwaway line where he's like, I don't have much time left, and that's all we get. And even once he does have his powers, there's nothing for him to do. He's fixed. Now he just needs to make sure he doesn't kill people. Eventually these cops show up, and I promise you these two cops serve no purpose in the story. They do nothing other than give Morbius something to do before Matt Smith becomes a villain. It was also hilarious that they investigated this boat, saw I think it was 8 people dead with all their blood drained, saw Martine alive, and assumed it was Morbius behind it. Like, sure, Martine works with Morbius, so therefore he must have been the one who turned into a vampire super killer. Again, no actual effort here from the writers. Eventually Milo, played by Matt Smith, becomes a vampire because he too is sick. Now he just starts killing people for fun. Anyone who even looks at him the wrong way gets killed. Why? Because as a kid he was bullied by other kids. This is the most shallow motivation ever. It's so lazy. For the rest of the movie, Morbius and Milo just fight each other and Milo dies. There's no effort here in the fights. Sure, there are a few cool shots, I'll give the movie that, but the fighting is just the two wrestling each other with some weird effects behind them. Oh, how could I forget the fact that in the middle of one of these fights, Morbius starts flying? To make matters even worse, the post-credit scene somehow manages to be the laziest scene of them all, setting up some connection with Vulture from the MCU. Morbius scored a 15% on Rotten Tomatoes. The film was memed so hard that it got a 71% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 5.1 out of 10. Morbius would end up grossing $167 million on a budget of $75 million, which means after marketing and distribution costs, Morbius likely lost money. So why was Morbius memed into oblivion? I mean, some of these memes are hilarious. A big part of the meme is that the movie is so lazy. I think lazy writing tends to be funnier than bad writing, I said this before, but the biggest reason why it was memed so hard has to be because of Jared Leto. People hate Jared Leto. It's that simple. He is an alleged cult leader and sexual predator. When it turns out his movie is dog shit, people have no qualms about making fun of him because of it. If Andrew Garfield or Henry Cavill starred in this role, and keep in mind these are two comic book actors that fans love, I don't think this movie would have been memed so hard. But because it's Jared Leto, no fan feels bad making fun of this failure. Morbius is also the gift that just kept on giving. For those of you who don't know, Jared Leto is a method actor, which means he literally tries to become the character he's playing. On set, he would pretend to have the same disability the character has, and his bathroom breaks would turn out to be like 45 minutes long. There's something comical about Leto devoting this much effort to Morbius. There's also the fact that Tyrese Gibson genuinely thought Martin Scorsese praised this movie, and he made an Instagram post about it. To cap it all off, Sony re-released this movie in theaters because of how quote-unquote popular it was, but no one saw the re-release, which means Morbius might be the first movie to ever bomb twice. This movie was just a disaster on every front. Morbius is the pinnacle of the failure of the Sonyverse. Madam Web is hilarious. It somehow manages to be worse than Morbius, which seems impossible. Now, unlike Morbius, I actually saw this movie in theaters, and I was laughing the whole time. Of course, I will dive into the storytelling reasons why this movie is so abysmal, but we need to discuss the main reason why this movie is so funny, and that's because of Dakota Johnson. You see, Dakota Johnson's performance in this movie makes it seem like she genuinely hates her role. Cassie seems like the most miserable and unlikable person in the world. This girl is a paramedic, mind you, and she seems to hate everyone. Throughout the movie, she is doing good things, like saving people and trying to protect these girls, but she talks to these people like they're the most annoying people in her life. The mix of Dakota Johnson's acting along with the aloofness of her character makes for some of the most unintentionally funny lines of dialogue. Fun fact, Dakota Johnson signed on for this movie because she thought she was going to be in the MCU. Once she found out what kind of movie she was actually in, she fired her agent. Yeah, that's how happy she was. So already this movie is not off to a good start. But let's dive deeper. Why is this movie so bad? There are a handful of reasons why, and I can't put them all into one bucket. So let's break it down one by one. I think what's the most offensive thing about this movie is that the writers think the audience is a bunch of idiots. Mind you, this movie was written by the people who also wrote Morbius and Gods of Egypt. Really high quality stuff here. The dialogue in this movie is written as if people watching have no brain cells. Cassie has to spell everything out to the viewer. When she's talking to her cat, she's like, "Oh, us strays need to stick together." Really subtle. The entire process of Cassie learning about her powers is also hilarious. There are like 5 instances of her having visions of the future and then going back into the present and being wildly confused. I think after the 3rd time this happens, you should be 100% clear about what's going on. But every time it does happen, Cassie keeps looking around like, "Oh, what's going on? Did I just see the future?" The writers, again, either think we're all idiots or that Cassie is an idiot. But either way, the writers don't understand a lick about subtlety. Also, like Morbius, this movie is so lazy. The whole plot of this movie centers around the villain Ezekiel Sims, who wants to kill these 3 girls. He's having visions of the future where they kill him. Why? We don't know. So Sims proceeds to try and find these girls, and based on images of his dreams, he successfully gets his assistant to find these girls on some surveillance technology that he only has and no one else. Meanwhile, his motivations for doing so are hilariously conveyed. Is there any nuance here? No. He just repeatedly says, "I came from nothing. I built an empire. I will not let these girls destroy what I have built." What exactly is his empire? What specifically was his childhood like? We don't know. All we know is that he's a bad guy. How does he actually go about trying to kill these girls? Does he hire assassins with his massive wealth? No. Does he wait until each one of these girls is alone and kill them individually? No. He just walks into a train without any sort of protection or cover and plans on strangling them in the open. Great plan. Another thing about this movie being so lazy is that the characters make decisions that don't align with their motivations. I just went over it with the villain. With Cassie, she wants to protect these girls. Instead of taking them somewhere safe, like the police, she brings them to the middle of the woods. And then she brings them to a motel. The big question here is, why didn't she bring them to the authorities? The movie wants us to believe it's because the police are after her, but Cassie could easily prove her innocence. Also, while she is trying to protect the girls, Cassie at one point flies all the way to Peru to get answers, leaving the girls behind. With these girls, they deserve just as much blame here. Why these girls agree to follow around Cassie instead of going to the authorities themselves is also a great question. These aren't helpless 10-year-old girls. They're basically adults, but they decide to helplessly follow Cassie around while she berates them and talks down to them. Also, these girls are some of the most shallow and uninteresting characters. Besides some cliches you might expect from the girls, there is no other depth to them. The movie eventually ends with a big CGI fight that would be expected from a D-list superhero movie like this. And that's it. That's Madam Web. Madam Web scored a 10% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 53% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 4.1 out of 10. The movie would end up grossing $100 million at the box office on a budget of also around $100 million. So financially, this movie was even more of a failure than Morbius. Honestly, it was likely this movie that led to Sony canceling all non-Spider-Man related projects. These movies were all failures in one way or another, but Madam Web is what caused the Sonyverse to die. Venom: The Last Dance is superhero slop. Movies like Morbius and Madam Web are truly in another class of bad, but movies like Venom 3 are just so soulless and lazy. I think I find these movies a bit more disappointing because it is a sequel to the first Venom movie, a movie that, while not perfect, was actually a serviceable movie with a lot to like. Venom 3 at least still has Eddie and Venom, and sure, there are still a handful of solid moments between the two, but overall their dynamic is such a shallow version of what came before. One thing that frustrates me the most about these movies is that as they progress, Eddie becomes more and more of a degenerate. This guy was once a respectable reporter. He sabotaged his marriage so he could get info to expose a billionaire, and now 3 movies later, he's basically a college kid with no direction with his life. Characters can be both competent and funny. You don't have to degrade a character to make him funny, so I just really don't like that. Also, I was quite disappointed that Anne wasn't in the movie. I was more than thrilled that Eddie didn't get back together with her in the first movie or even the second movie, but having them not get together is kind of disappointing by the end, and to make matters worse, she's just not even in the movie, let alone getting back together. It doesn't feel like this movie fits into the trilogy. It's more so like a spin-off where Venom dies in the end. So there's a lot of little things about the direction of this movie that I don't love. It also doesn't make things better that this movie is the epitome of laziness. This movie, more so than even the previous movies, have some of the worst exposition I've ever seen. Granted, I guess it doesn't compare to Madam Web or Morbius. The movie literally begins with this video game looking bad guy just spelling out exactly who he is to the audience. The funny thing about exposition this bad is that I don't even remember what he said. Now, the exposition doesn't stop here. How do we learn that Eddie is now a fugitive? Because of a report on the TV. How do we know about the Codex? Through exposition. How do we learn about what the scientists are up to? From the scientists just walking through the hallway and talking. Even the main objective for Eddie and Venom, which is to get to New York, is because Eddie just says out of the blue, maybe I could blackmail this lawyer and then he could help us. When important details are told to us through weak exposition, it just feels like it doesn't matter. The whole movie hinges on Eddie going to New York, but it doesn't feel like it's that important. It also doesn't hurt that once Eddie and Venom get to Vegas, they're more focused on gambling and dancing than they are finding a ride to New York. The only bit of information that wasn't given to us through meaningless exposition was the backstory to this one science lady, which is really strange, mind you, considering she is not that important to the story at all. I really dislike this movie. It just does everything that I typically hate in comic book movies. It retcons stuff that came before just so there can be a plot. By the way, whenever I watch a movie that has a MacGuffin called the Codex, I instantly tune out. Venom 3 is easily the weakest of the Venom movies, and it's not even close. And considering Venom 2 is not that good either, that says a lot about Venom 3. Venom 3 scored a 40% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 79% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6 out of 10. Venom 3 grossed $478 million at the box office, which makes it the lowest grossing movie of the trilogy. Kraven the Hunter is maybe the most forgettable of the Sonyverse movies. In a world where you have the Venom trilogy, that will automatically be somewhat memorable, and then you have Morbius and Madam Web, two of the most hilariously bad comic book movies ever. So that just leaves Kraven, a movie that is so uninspired and so boring, but not offensive. This movie came out 1 year ago, and it is a Marvel movie, but no one either remembers it or knows it exists. So what makes Kraven so bad and so forgettable? Well, first and foremost, of all the Sonyverse movies I've covered in this video, I actually thought this one had the most potential to be good, but it makes no effort to do anything with its concept. So Kraven and his brother are the sons of some crime boss. In a way too long flashback, the father wants to test the sons to see which one is more ready to take over his empire. The oldest son, Sergey, aka Kraven, eventually becomes a superhero after his blood is mixed with Lion's blood, and then there is some magic from a random girl. And the other son is a bit softer and doesn't get the respect from their father. Eventually, the younger brother is captured because he is the son of a crime boss, and then Kraven has to go save him. He does, and that's the movie. The reason I say this movie has potential is because of the father-son dynamic. There could have been something interesting with the sons hating the father, and then at the end of the movie, both sons end up becoming a big part of the father. Kraven has become a massive killer, and Dmitri, the other son, is trying to take over his dad's empire. That has potential for a pretty depressing ending. Now, the movie does try and go down this direction, but is this final moment actually given any weight? No. After the final fight, the two brothers meet, and Dimitri's like, Sergey, you're a killer just like our father, and I got an off-screen operation and I'm gonna take over my father's empire. This movie, like almost every other movie in the Sonyverse, has no subtlety to its dialogue. There's no attempt at nuance or anything like that. The characters say exactly what they mean all the time, even if these big character moments are not established. I'm sorry, but Kraven is nothing like his father, and the turn at the end from his brother was even more forced. This is the shit that makes Kraven so forgettable. Like, the stuff isn't funny bad, it's just lazy and disappointing. It's not until over halfway through this movie where the plot kicks in. When I was watching, I remember getting to the hour mark of a 2-hour movie and wondering what the hell the plot was. This is because the movie spent so much time developing the two brothers and the father, but it wasn't meaningful development. It was just a waste of time. Now, what else was horrible about this movie? Of course, the CGI was pathetic. The rhino looked terrible. To make matters even worse, the Rhino was a terrible villain too. Throughout all 6 of these movies, not a single villain was given more than the bare minimum of depth, and the Rhino applies to that. I had a good laugh over the inclusion of Calypso in this movie. Now keep in mind, I don't know anything about the Kraven lore, but someone with a name as unique as Calypso has to be a comic book character. She felt so shoehorned into this movie. It's like Kraven just talks to her in a few out of place scenes, and then she does one thing in the end that was not set up properly at all. Shit like this is why people look at the Sonyverse so poorly. These movies are lazy, often boring, and are just a pathetic use of resources from a major studio. And of course, Kraven is no exception. The movie scored a 15% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 72% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 5.5 out of 10. Kraven would end up grossing just $62 million on a budget of around $110 million. So this movie makes Morbius look like a huge success. Now here comes the tricky part. If I had to rank these movies from best to worst, how would I rank them? This may be one of the hardest rankings I've ever done just because of how bad these movies all are. I would say the least bad, aka the best, would be Venom 1. This is the only movie of the 6 that I would actually consider to be a respectable film. Number 2 would be Venom 2. I think this movie shares enough positive elements of the first movie that I can put it at number 2. At 3 would have to be Kraven. I didn't mention this in the Kraven section, but at least the action was a lot of fun, so gun to my head, I could enjoy it for that. Number 4 would be Venom 3. At this point, this movie wasn't offensive, so it automatically goes in number 4. Now what's worse, Madam Web or Morbius? This is really tough. I'm tentatively going to go with Morbius at 5 and Madam Web at 6. Madam Web is funnier because of how bad it is, so you could argue it's more entertaining, but in reality, it's just such a bad movie that it needs to go in last place. So those are my thoughts on the Sonyverse. What did you think about these movies? Do you hate them all? Do you actually like a few of them? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Glod Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.